Alfalfa is very efficient degrading what has to be degraded in the rumen.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. I'm Reagan Bluel from the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and today our guest is Dr. Ferreira from Virginia Tech, and he's here to talk to us about some of the nuances of fiber digestion. And for decades, we've understood the impact of neutral detergent fiber, NDF, on total dry matter intake of your herd. However, over the past 5 or 10 years, our industry has taken massive leaps in understanding how impactful the undigestible portion of this NDF is. So, taking that into consideration and understanding the undigestible portion of NDF when formulating your ration, I think it will help your nutritionists meet the needs of the cows while maintaining appropriate rumen flow and therefore optimizing the digestion of all nutrients. So, they conducted an experiment that we're highlighting today that included 6 cannulated cows, 6 non-cannulated Holsteins, and they were all in mid-lactation, randomly assigned to 2 different rations. The results of this project is published in the most current Journal of Dairy Science article in press titled Ruminal Passage Rate and Digestibility of Fiber from Dairy Cows Consuming Diets Containing Alfalfa and Orchard Grass Hays with Different Concentrations of Undegradable Neutral Detergent Fiber. So, welcome to Dairy Science Digest. Could you please take a moment and just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So my name is Gonzalo Ferreira. I'm originally from Argentina, so you can tell my accent. I've been here at Virginia Tech since August 2013. My area of expertise is in dairy management, and my research and extension program it's oriented towards dairy nutrition and forage quality and management, in addition to dairy management in general, financial risk, and so on.
Oh, I love the sound of that because it's so often that we researchers just hyper focus on one specific topic. Like, I'm a nutritionist, I like nutrition, but in the end, it's got to be the system. It's got to be the financial side of things also to make sure. So I'll pick your brain on that here in the future. But I guess the first question I have for you is talking really about that queen of forages. You know, alfalfa's been coined that for all these years. But in your paper, you were feeding an orchard grass. And, you know, spoiler alert to all the listeners, it performed the same as far as milk production. But obviously, the NDF differed based on the title. So could you tell us how else did these hays differ? And was this just your average run-of-the-mill orchard grass?
Okay, yes, I will respond to that question very soon. Before anything, can you allow me, because I know I will forget that, and I have to say this, I have to acknowledge that this project was funded by the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. This is not a commercial source, so I want to disclose that before I do anything else. And let me start with the big picture. Typically, we talk about fiber. Obviously, fiber is very important to keep the rumen healthy, to provide fiber to the cows so they have that chewing activity. Also, it's important because of the chewing activity helps maintaining fat concentration in the milk. And obviously, if we have more components in the milk, we are going to increase the milk check. So that is kind of the big picture. Obviously, if we put too much fiber, we are going to start limiting dry matter intake, and we don't want to do that. Now, after saying that, there is something that is quite common when we compare alfalfa hay or alfalfa silage to temperate grasses, hay, or silage, okay? Typically, they are totally apples and oranges. They are not, we cannot compare them. Why is that? The reason for that is mainly that alfalfa typically has relatively lower concentrations of fiber or NDF. When I say fiber, I'm talking about neutral detergent fiber or NDF. Alfalfa has much lower concentrations of fiber than grasses in general. That puts grasses kind of on a bad position, if you want, because it has too much fiber.
Mhm.
And there is certain belief that, well, mixed grass hay, we cannot feed it to high producing dairy cows. The thing is that we can argue on that. Why is that? And there is where we come to segregating neutral detergent fiber into other components. We can separate fiber into two portions. One is called the potentially digestible, and the other one is going to be the undegradable. The undegradable fiber, we know that we define that as the fiber that even after a 240-hour incubation is not going to be degraded or digested. Then you have the difference of 100 minus the undegraded fiber is the potentially degradable fiber.
And so for terminology, when you're looking at a hay test, that is the
pdNDF.
pdNDF. Yes, right. Some slightly new terminologies when you're looking at your hay
Yes.
sample.
Now, if you think about it, so far we have been talking about the concentration of fiber or UNDF or pdNDF on a dry mature basis. Okay. Here for the nutritionists, when I teach dairy nutrition, I hammer the students a lot with as fed or dry mature basis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In this case, we need to go a step further and we have to talk on an NDF basis. What is the meaning of that? When you compare 100 units of NDF of alfalfa and 100 units of NDF of a grass, typically alfalfa has a greater proportion of UNDF than grasses. Okay.
All those stems, right?
Well, no, it's not just because of the stems. Well, yes, it is because of the stems. Also, alfalfa in the leaves has very little fiber.
Uh-huh.
It is more like the lignification of the tissues in alfalfa. Typically, it has more lignin, the cell wall in alfalfa than in grasses, and that is related to the stems, as you very well said. But big picture, typically on an NDF basis, alfalfa has greater proportions of UNDF than grasses. So if you think about that, if you compare NDF to NDF, then you might favor the grass
Over the alfalfa.
so
Yeah.
that is kind of a contradiction. So then why is alfalfa the queen of forages? So
Right.
there's what we were trying to do. And also we were trying to see in this study, what we did is we formulated to have around 30% NDF, okay, dietary NDF.
And that was on both diets, guys. So it was very equal in the NDF, and that was
Yes,
by design of the research. Yeah.
that was by design. Of that 30%, we wanted 10% to come from the corn silage, 10% to come from the hay, and the other 10% to come from the concentrate.
Were these dry hays or were they silage?
No, they were dry hays. To give you an idea, the alfalfa hay came from Kansas, and the orchard grass hay was locally grown here in Virginia. So yes, and in this case, the alfalfa had more UNDF than orchard grass. So the alfalfa had 38% NDF, the orchard grass had 63% NDF. So that is pretty much what we would expect. However, the UNDF on an NDF basis, as I was telling you before, was 36, almost 37% for the alfalfa and 33 for the orchard grass. Okay, more UNDF in that fiber for alfalfa than for orchard grass.
Very good. So, historically, we don't really think about feeding grasses to lactating dairy cows. So, how did you change the rations to kind of correct for the differences between the orchard grass and the alfalfa?
So that's a good question. First of all, maybe I will challenge the statement if you allow me. We don't feed grasses to high producing cows. Well, what is surprising to me that sometimes we include some wheat straw
Mm-hmm.
Provide some fiber, right?
Good
The
call.
thing is that it has so much fiber that you put little amounts. So it is doable. Actually, all this research to me was triggered. I started at Virginia Tech and I performed my very first study. I didn't have any alfalfa hay to feed to the cows, and when I use what we call here the fescue and orchard grass mixed hay,
Mm-hmm.
and the cows perform pretty well.
Yeah.
Uh, so again, it's a matter of the formulation. And yes, we had to manage that difference in the crude protein. The beauty about alfalfa, why is alfalfa an excellent forage? Well, in my opinion, is because I always say, what is the best forage? And I respond, the one that allows you to formulate the diet that covers the requirement of the animal at
Mm-hmm.
the minimum cost possible. Well, because you have very high concentration of crude protein, alfalfa is very good. Also, you're providing fiber
There you
that
go.
is very good. So that is one of the beauties of alfalfa. You're saving a lot on that protein. In the case of the orchard grass hay, we needed to supplement some protein ingredients into the diet to balance. And that was a big argument with the reviewers. Well, you're mixing different ingredients. Yeah, and that is true. But when you are feeding some ingredients that are so different in the diet, you have no option.
You have to. You have to. It goes back to what you were saying. It's a matter of the formulation because those microorganisms in the rumen, they don't see it as orchard grass or alfalfa or soybean meal or anything like that. They just see
Yeah.
units of protein. They see units of starch. They see units of fiber. And so I just can't help but quote you even a third time. It's a matter of the formulation. And that's just a great way to put it. And I think what you experienced with your very first research project there at Virginia Tech is commonplace to dairymen that might be listening in, especially in a hard year. Maybe your alfalfa got tagged by a bunch of insects this particular year because that queen of forage, let's be real, she's kind of fickle. That's a fickle queen. And sometimes those homegrown alfalfa patches are a challenge, and you feed what you got because that's what you got to do. And so I think that this is a very real research project and an opportunity for producers to learn directly from ruminant nutritionists on how to navigate the situation when you've got some pretty nice orchard
Right.
grass and making that
Continuing
work
with
for your milk
the
herd.
strategy of this study, given that we formulated to similar dietary NDF, 30%, that was the target.
Mm-hmm.
And if one of those hays has a greater concentration of UNDF, we were kind of wondering, okay, how is the rumen dynamics going to be affected because of that
Mm-hmm.
UNDF? Is that UNDF somehow, because UNDF can only live through passage,
Mm-hmm.
is that kind of going to block the passage
Mm-hmm.
of digestion through out of the room?
Kind of slow things
And
down.
that's why the main variable of interest in this study was the passage rate, seeing how those haze affect the rate of passage.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about dry matter intake. What did your team observe when you measured the amount of intake for the alfalfa versus the orchard grass ration?
On the intake side, there was a greater dry matter intake for the alfalfa than for the orchard grass. And this is something that has been observed in other studies from our lab and from other labs. So this is common to have more intake. One thing I do want to clarify here on the performance side, and that includes dry matter intake,
Mm-hmm.
that was not the main goal of the study. We used only 12 cows in total, obviously in a crossover design, but our main variable of interest was the rumen, the dynamics of the ruminal contents.
Sure.
I want to clarify that on the production side, maybe this experiment does not have the right statistical power
Statistical
to
power.
bring out
Mm-hmm.
conclusions. But yes, dry matter intake was statistically significant, statistically different between alfalfa and the orchard grass, and it was greater for alfalfa.
By like 4.5 pounds, really.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to keep hitting the point that was only 12 cows, but 4.5 pounds is quite a lot of dry matter intake
Yeah,
difference.
yeah,
It
that
seems like.
difference on dry matter intake could be expectable. Yes, almost 4.5. Again, with an error of 0.7 kilograms, that would be 1.4 pounds of
Plus or minus.
error, right? Now, what I invite you and the audience to think about this is how is it possible that with more undigestible NDF,
Mm-hmm.
the animal can eat more? If you're putting more undigestible fiber in the rumen,
Mm-hmm.
there is only one way that that animal can eat more, and that is cleaning, if you allow me, the rumen faster.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that means a faster rate of passage. And that is something that we have observed in this study. So the passage rate was faster for the alfalfa hay diet than for the orchard grass hay diet.
So, if I could have you pause there just a little bit, let's dive into the weeds just a touch and kind of step away from this particular research project. And just as you're observing these results as a nutritionist, can you talk more generally about how you would advise dairymen and nutritionists listening in about that rumen pool size and ration strategy with flow rates involved? Because the dynamic of the rumen changes relative to what you're feeding her, and understanding that dynamic will help you become a better dairyman or a better nutritionist. So if you could just speak at the kind of 30,000 foot about how that could or should be observed and then utilized as a nugget of information to improve production.
Yes, I think the most important thing here is I will use the words of my grad student that she was involved in this, Haley Gallion. She was the main author here. The delicate balance between the rate of passage and the rate of digestion. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In order a feed to be digested, it has to be exposed to the degradation. So if the feed passes too fast, it's not going to have the sufficient time to be degraded.
Right.
Now, if the feed goes very slow, obviously you are going to be increasing the digestibility of that feed. However, the animal is going to be consuming less. So the idea is to have a good balance between the digestion and the passage.
Sweet spot.
Okay. And that is something very, very interesting in this study is that, and from alfalfa in general, when you see in situ studies, alfalfa, even though it has a greater concentration of UNDF in the fiber, the thing is that the pdNDF is digested very, very fast.
Those leaves just kind of explode in the
Well,
rumen,
not
don't
only
they?
the leaves, also happens in the stems. Okay. So when you compare the digestion rates, for example, alfalfa and corn silage, yes, corn silage has much lower concentration of UNDF. However, to reach that level of UNDF, it needs much more than 48 hours. Okay. In the case of alfalfa, I would say close to 72 hours, pretty much most of the pdNDF, that is the potentially degradable fiber, is going to be already degraded. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the fiber as such passes out, there is not much potentially digested fiber going out of the room. It's like alfalfa is very efficient degrading what has to be degraded in the room.
Mm-hmm. As a field specialist with Extension, I march across all of the state of Missouri declaring the need to take a forage sample, right? And as guys are finally finishing up here in the hayfield this year, and maybe I can convince them to sample their hay. And if I do, what forage sample test should dairymen be selecting? And is there anything in particular about the laboratory that analysis that they need to know so that the analysis that they get is the most informative?
Oh, that's a very good question that could have a complicated answer. So, first of all, if you want to analyze the alfalfa from a dairy formulation perspective, having the kinetics, in my case, We use CNCPS for
Mm-hmm.
formulating the diets, and for that you need
Mm-hmm.
the kinetics. That would be ideal, no? What is the meaning of having the kinetics? When you submit a sample, they are going to provide you the digestibility of the fiber at different time points,
Uh-huh.
like 24, 30 hours, 48, 240, and you can use that information later for the formulation. Now, how do you compare those? It is very
Mm-hmm.
hard. Again, I go back to my definition. The best forage is the one that allows you to formulate the cheapest diet while
Mm-hmm.
you are covering the requirements of the animal,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. And you know, in those kinetic datas, guys, here's the deal. It's kind of costly, and it often is a wet chemistry analysis. But what's more costly is the opportunity of misdiagnosing what that flow rate of the rumen is and limiting the total digestion of your ration. Because we know for every unit digested, that should translate to milk. It gets absorbed through the sidewall of the rumen and straight to the udder and sends those nutrients where they're needed to generate a product that you can then sell. So those hay samples are so incredibly important. And I hope you're encouraged after this conversation to not only sample your hay, but also work with a nutritionist or an extension specialist of your state to be sure to get that ration formulated to best meet your herd's needs. So you were kind of tiptoeing around it, but could I be so bold to ask what was the cost of these two rations? Did one outshine the other?
These are experimental diets, and we use ingredients that we might not use on the real world. The diets on the orchard grass might be cheaper than in the case of alfalfa. If you put the income over feed cost, they could be very similar. Sometimes could be even maybe in favor for the grass. It depends.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on, because you can have a little extra fat. In this case, was not difference between the two diets.
Mm-hmm.
You study, we saw a little more fat with the grass hay, and that can affect your price depending on what is the price of the fat at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, particularly, alfalfa had about 2.2 pounds more of production, but statistically speaking, that was not different.
Mm-hmm.
So the energy corrected milk was not different either. However, the alfalfa, they ended up eating more. So
Right.
you have to put everything together. And maybe in this study, it costs more to feed the alfalfa. That protein that you can get from the haylage, it can help you to especially in those years that commodity prices are super high.
Huge
uh,
difference.
that the forage providing you protein is super important to allow you to formulate the cheapest diet possible. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm totally convinced that with alfalfa, with a good protein concentration, you can still provide fiber, you can still provide energy, and you're providing protein at very cheap levels. So
Sometimes that margin matters,
yeah,
when the milk price is where it's at and
yeah,
commodities are high. That's the difference between black and red.
yeah. Even though the price per ton can be substantial, when you see the whole TMR, you might be saving some money. So
Mm-hmm. Good nuggets of information there. Okay, so I mean, if you were looking a producer square in the eyes that is just over the drama of growing the queen of forages every, cutting that hayfield every 28 days and hoping that the clouds will part just the way they're supposed to, and what would you say to them?
I would say I really like alfalfa. I wish I had more here at Virginia Tech to use it. Maybe not so much as hay, but as haylage to provide some moisture to that
Yeah.
TMR while you are providing a lot of nutrients. So definitely, I wish we can grow more. One thing, if we see alfalfa, the acreage in the US is declining. And I don't know exactly what is the reason for that.
Mm.
I think there are some reasons different than the typical agronomic issues, management of the alfalfa, maybe diseases and so on. And this is a hypothesis, okay? But maybe we farmers are having money for doing cover crops,
Mm,
And maybe that is a way of,
supplemental income.
yeah, not stimulating the farmers to do more alfalfa. Honestly, if you formulate, let's say that you have plenty of haylage, alfalfa haylage,
Hmm.
you can formulate very cheap diets
Sure. If it's high quality.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
for sure. Okay, so I think if I were to kind of reword what you were just saying, though, guys, you heard it from the nutritionist's mouth here. He really likes alfalfa still. And so if you stay strong and get it harvested when you're supposed to get it harvested and everything aligns just right, there's just pretty much nothing that'll replace high quality alfalfa, even especially haylage, to a dairy ration. It still maybe is the queen, but it takes a sharp pencil to make sure that it's still working in your operation, but make sure that you divide that cost of production, and as you're analyzing it, you take into consideration that that's the duration of the stand. If you could replace it with a small grain or a cover crop or something like that, you have the input cost every single year versus the stand of an alfalfa is gonna persist and be longer. I know something that I talk to my growers about with some regularity is considering using that lower lignin alfalfa varieties to, not only because we all hate lignin, but because it kind of gives them a little more flexibility in that cutting window. So if you're not able to get on it at 28 days, it gives you some flexibility in that, and the lignin doesn't lay down quite as heavy. And high quality homegrown forage, it's really important to the bottom line.
absolutely.
Good. So my favorite question I like to ask every interviewee is, if you were talking to a group of dairymen, which I hope you are here on the podcast today, what would you like boots on the ground dairy producers to gain from this informative project?
So maybe my main message here, in addition to farmers, maybe goes to nutritionists. One thing that I'm learning, the first thing is that I have more questions than answers. And I'm also learning more and more that there is no a single variable to define the quality of a forage. Okay.
That's right.
I give an example. Some data from our lab. Alfalfa stems, they can have 60% UNDF on an
Mhm.
NDF basis. That means of 100 units, only 40 units are going to be potentially degradable. That sounds
Right.
bad.
Yeah.
If you do the stems of summer grasses, 40% is UNDF. That means that 60 is potentially degradable NDF. Obviously,
Right.
you see that and you go towards the grasses,
Grasses.
right? However, if, as I said before, the pdNDF is digested so fast, by 48 hours, 98% of that fiber is degraded in alfalfa, and only 78 is degraded on the grasses. Again, is UNDF the only thing that we have to see? No.
There's something
Oh,
else. Yeah.
yeah. Also, do we have to see the percentage of degradation of that fiber? I don't think so. I can give you an example. A 4.2% degradation per hour sounds very good versus a 2.6. Well, however, the 4.2 is the straw, the wheat straw, 2.6 is in fresh grass. Okay.
Yeah.
The thing is that the straw has very little to degrade. So that percent alone doesn't say much either. So again, when we are analyzing these forages for ration formulation, it's like we have to see a combo of variables and put everything together and see how the different ingredients end up providing you the best TMR for your needs.
It's really kind of a concert, right? Each
Yes.
ingredient in the ration is a different instrument. And without that particular trumpet playing at right the right time, then things aren't just going to sound as good, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
each one of those different ingredients adds something to the ration. And same goes with the components that the hay brings to the ration. It's I think the one thing that I'm assured of, the more I interview nutritionists on this podcast, is that rumen is still a little bit of a black box. We just don't necessarily know everything that's going on there, despite having studied it for decades. right?
And
But what I do know for sure is that that bovine is such a beautiful beast, and her ability to translate green grass, or in this case, alfalfa hay and orchard grass, into meat and milk that we can sell and feed the world with. So I really think this has been a really fun, great discussion. And I want to thank you for your time, Doc. And listeners, I really applaud you for taking time out of your day to better understand where grasses might fit in your operation. And this has been the September edition of the Dairy Science Digest. It's a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles in press because it's sound science to base your management decisions around, provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluel with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.